In this video, we're going to look at editing some of the Automata design for the box, and then we're going to add in the standardized parts that we created in the previous video and start seeing what kind of stuff we can get with our design. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to find my box right, and I'm going to say activate component, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose the whole command. And from here, I'm going to select the side of the box. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn to the right side here, and we have a diameter of 0.5 here, and what we're going to do is I'm going to choose from our references. I'm just going to click on the edge. This needs to be 2 inches from the front, and then from the, again, you don't want to go to the top there, you want to go to the top of the side piece, and this needs to be 2 inches. So centrally located in the side piece. And what I'm going to do here is, rather than say distance, I'm going to go ahead and say through all, and it's actually going to end up, when you look here, it's going to go all the way through to the other side. So it's actually going to create a hole in the other component for us. And I'm going to say OK. So now I'm going to create the top level. Here's our holes. And now I can start looking at bringing in some of our components we created. So let me open up my data panel. And I'm going to go ahead and drag in the axle bushing and place it into our model. And I'm going to go ahead and get this positioned. I like to get these positioned into place of how they would be assembled before I start doing any joints. And that's so because a lot of the snap points and everything, the joint origins will line up and everything's set up there. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And then I'm going to go ahead and drag in another axle bushing. Now I can't move or copy in this file because these are separate design files. You're going to see this is kind of representative of a bottom-up modeling approach, because see the links there? So that means these files were made in separate design files, whereas all the box parts are in one file. This is top down, and here this is going to be bottom up. So let's go ahead and try this out though. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a joint, and I'm going to choose a revolute joint. So since these guys aren't put together, I don't want to use as-built joint. So as-built joint is if I go through and I model these in place where I want them. For joint, I want to go ahead, and these are parts that are not put together. So I'm going to go ahead and select kind of this black kind of circle around the outside edge, and you'll see the joint origin chip will show up right there in directly the center of the hole. And then what I'm going to do is I want that to be clicked right here, so then that way that goes. Now I'm going to change the motion. Either I can click on the tab in the dialog, or I can click this little shortcut menu, which I like to do, and I want to change that to a revolute joint. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with this axle bushing here. Choose the circle right around there. Choose the outside edge. It's already going to say revolute joint, and we're going to be able to have that going. And I'm going to say OK. Now, one thing I'm going to do while we're at this, before we forget, is I'm going to, under Assemble, I want to motion link these two revolute joints. So I'm going to go ahead and click that revolute joint. I can click on the icon. I can also expand the folder, and I can select the two right there. So then that way that they're going to be turning in the same direction. But you're going to see they're not necessarily, because they're flipped to each other. So a motion link may not be the best thing, but what we'll see is probably our axle is going to be brought in and going to help fix that for us. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that in. Drag the axle in. Again, I want to kind of position it in the orientation that I'm going to install it. And I'm going to do this. Okay, so one thing I want to do with these revolute joints, so I want to make sure they're set at 0 degrees. That one looks good. I'm going to hit escape. This one looks good. So you can click on any of the joint icons and also edit them as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose the joint. I want to choose the end point, and let me do that one more time. I think the video, here we go. So I want to choose the very end point. You're going to see these little joint origin points, and I want to choose the very center on the end, and I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to find that on the hole. So if I hover over this face, now you'll notice as I move to the hole, it wants to try to pick these inside faces. I'm going to hold the control key, and that's going to lock down, so that way I can only pick these selections that I'm kind of cycling through. And I want to find the corresponding one, which is right in the middle. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put that in there. Now you're going to notice I really don't want a revolute joint. I want it to be rigid. Now you'll see the axle is not inside, so I'm just going to hit the flip button and I can kind of flip that. Now I'm going to turn this to the front before I accept it. I really want to make sure this is kind of even on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of drag this over. I'm going to do an offset. And the offset usually I think is about 0.75. You can actually put in a little bit more. And actually that's not quite exactly even, but we can always adjust as well. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK. So now here's what I can do is if I click and drag on this is that you're going to see this one and this one are going to turn together, and then anytime I drag on the axle bushing, the axle turns. If I drag on the axle bushing will turn. So you'll notice that. Now let's go over to the other side. You'll notice it's not following with what we want. So here's the thing that I'm going to do. Let me go ahead and set the 0 position for the revolute joint, and let me go ahead and go over here to this one and let's set the 0 position there. Now here's what the easiest thing to do. This is kind of doing a combination. Let's do the as-built joint. Rigid, this axle bushing and the axle, and we say OK. Now you'll notice when I turn the axle bushing, these guys are stuck together and these guys just like the other side. So it made it real easy for us. Alright, so there's where we can kind of go through and get that going. I'm going to go ahead and drag in also my crank handle, and it may take it a second to process to put the crank handle in. Let me go ahead and drag this in, and let me get this into the proper position. And the way I kind of want this as well is I want the crank handle when it's installed, I want it to be in the lowest position. So I'm going to do it like this. I'm going to say OK. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to joint, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn this around, because the face that I want is I actually want this face. I'm going to hover over. I'm going to choose the center of the hole like I did before, but I want to choose that back face. So you'll see where the joint origin chip is, and then I'm going to go up here to the axle bushing. I want it to be right up against there, and even though the axle's in place, you can see I'm kind of snapping to the center, and I want to click that same spot, and now that's going to put it right up against the axle bushing and go from there, and I'm going to say OK. So now here is our particular axle bushing and everything like that, and here we can kind of get a little bit of some idea of what we have. Now 7 inches is probably a little bit too much on the axle, so I'm going to measure this, and so I'm going to go ahead and see, okay, well what's the from this point to the outside edge on that point, and the only thing is that you can kind of see it gives me a diagonal line. So let me restart. Let me click this corner. Let me do the axle bushing, and I know 5.375, and then I need to add a 1/4 of an inch to that. So if I want this to be sized up perfectly, let me go ahead and hit close. 5.375. Let's open up, not the crank. Let's open up not the follower. Let's do the axle. So I guess it's getting a little late. So what we're going to see here is I'm going to change the extrusion edit feature instead of our looks like let me look at the axle. There we go. And it says 7 inches, 5.375 plus, and then let's put 0.25 in there, and let's say OK. And then now let's go ahead and save. And then let's go back to this Automata design file. Now the only thing is that it does need to update. So I'm going to say get all latest. And then now, here's the only thing, is that I may need to go through and make an adjustment, because now it's shortened it. So let's look at that rigid joint that I had placed earlier. Let's right click and say edit joint. There was no offset on that one, but it was probably rigid 8. Here we go. So now let's do an offset of 0 and say OK. Looks like I still need to do a little bit of an offset, probably about a 1/4 of an inch. Say OK. There we go. So now our axle's all set up in place in the exact way. So if you're wanting to edit components, modify them, that's how you can go through and do that in your Automata design. At this point, we're going to finish the video and take a look next at adding in some other components, such as the follower guides, holes in the top, things like that, and we'll continue on with the project.